Good afternoon. My name is Joe Littell. I'm from the Student Orgs and Activities Office at Northwestern, and thank you for joining for another session of SOA Chats. Today, we are focusing on funding and fundraising tips and tricks for registered student orgs. This is a really popular topic, whether it's groups that have really high budgets and put on big budget events, to groups that are just starting out and they want to know all of the resources available to them to seek funding at Northwestern. Today, I am joined by a few co-panelists, Chelsea Mattson, as well as Andy Grossman. They'll be sharing some information about their role in student org funding and fundraising. But for now, I'd like to get started with just some general terminology for folks who are unfamiliar at Northwestern, as well as just the general, how do you find funding if you're a student org? So for those of you who may be treasurer, or former treasurer, or advisor, you're going to be familiar with a few of these. But just as a reminder, when we refer to SOFO, that's the Student Organization Finance Office that is physically located in the Norris Center. And registered student organizations have accounts with SOFO, just like an individual would have an account at a bank or a credit union. That is where an org's assets are held. And there are certain restrictions around the funding within SOFO because it's under the Northwestern umbrella. Right next to SOFO, there's cashier services. And that's a spot that offers a variety of financial services to student organization accounts as well as individuals. It's where a student would make a deposit to a student organization account. If they're having an event and they need a cash box or cash bag to make change, cashier services can provide that as well. And they also manage a debit card program for student organizations that want to load money onto a card for individual students in the org to use, among other services. The next term is the chart string. Every student organization that has a SOFO account, there's a corresponding chart string account that goes with SOFO. So SOFO manages hundreds of accounts for student organizations, departments, and other projects. The chart string is Northwestern's universal accounting identifier. So whether it's specific to grants or allocations, it's helpful for the officers in the organization to know the chart string that corresponds to their organization's SOFO account number. So you may hear us use some of these terms in the session today. The last three I want to share are grants, and they come from a variety of sources, both within Northwestern and outside. Many of the grants that are available to Northwestern student orgs are restricted to groups that have active SOFO accounts. This is for purposes of accounting to initiate transfers between, say, a department's account line into a student group's SOFO account. There are some grants that are available just to any individual, and they have other means of getting that individual their money, and they may not need a SOFO account. So for any group or individual that's seeking a grant related to a project or an activity, it's important to know what some of those conditions are to receive a grant. A term you're going to be hearing most likely a few times today, probably from Andy, is allocations. And these are the amounts of money that Associated Student Government initiates transfers to student organizations directly. So groups apply for allocation amounts based on their need, and the Finance Committee makes decisions on allocations periodically as they have funding cycles. And the last term is account lines. So some student organizations have really simple SOFO accounts, maybe just one account line or two account lines. But there's other organizations that, depending on the sources of the money or how it's used or some of the conditions on how it can be used, have really complicated account lines. And so this is a screen grab that we also shared last week in the Wildcat Connection SOA chat. And it's important for advisors and treasurers and other officers in the organization to have a clear understanding of what all of these accounts are intended for. And if any of these accounts go into the negative, the account might be frozen overall. So these are good discussion points between members of the organization as they have expenses to spend money from the accounts that maybe have more restrictions attached to them or a timeline attached to them before spending money from accounts that might have hardly any restrictions attached to them. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to our first guest panelist, Andy Grossman. And Andy, why don't you introduce yourself as I stop sharing my screen, and you can go ahead and get some visuals pulled up.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. Very excited to be here. So I am the co-chair of the Student Activities Finance Committee, which basically is in charge of, as Joe said, all of the allocations to our student groups. So I have a quick little presentation here just to give a quick overview to people who are not familiar with our committee. So let me know if you can see my screen. Perfect. Awesome. So starting off, so we are the Student Activities Finance Committee. We distribute the student activity fee pool to over 140 SAFC recognized student groups. We do this by holding quarterly funding cycles, and we allocate funding requests for the future events. So we have a funding cycle coming up this fall quarter. And that will be distributing funds for events that will be taking place in winter 2021 and spring 2021. And our committee is structured as we're broken into 5 different tiers, and each tier is based off of the amount of funding groups receive. So the groups that receive the most amount of funding are in tier 1, and the groups that receive the least amount of funding are in tier 5. So how to become an SAFC recognized group? So you need to be SOA approved for at least 1 year. And this is just so that student groups can prove that they are sustainable and that there is a need for this group on campus. Then there's an application process, and then our committee deliberates on this application and would approve your group if you hit all of our criteria that we're looking for with new student groups. And then you'll become automatically a tier 5 group, and you're eligible for up to $300 of funding for the first event that you're applying for. And just wanted to preface this is that we are not the only funding option for groups. There are many other funding options available to student groups on campus. So just quickly, this is an overwhelming slide, but just quickly what we fund. So through funding applications, we obviously got a lot of requests that we unfortunately cannot all hit on. So the biggest thing that we're looking for is sustainability within groups. So we want to make sure that what we're funding you will last, will have an impact on students, but also will last in the future. So for buying costumes, we want to make sure that they are sustainable and that they can be reused for shows in the future years. So that's just some of the stuff that we're looking for, but our most popular events are speaker events. So we pay for contracts and honorarium for speaker to come in. If a venue needs to be rented out for these speakers, we will also pay for that, and we'll cover hotel and transportation costs as well. So we do fund a lot of different things. I think what's important to keep in mind is stuff that we do not fund as well. So something that we don't fund is anything that we deem as a committee that is unsustainable. So for example, food for a meeting, that's not something that you can get funding for from our committee, just because we don't view that as a good use of funds to impact the entire student body. Something else that we don't fund is like merchandise for groups and for members, and then unsustainable decorations that are going to be thrown out after one event. So that's just some idea of what we do and don't fund, and we can go into more specifics if you have specific questions by just emailing us. So just general announcements that we have. Our funding application for this quarter that I just spoke about is due this weekend on November 1st. So make sure if you're applying for funding this quarter for events in the winter and in the spring that you are getting that application in, and you can reach out to us at our email. We can send it to you if you do not already have access to that application. I think the biggest thing for our committee this year that we discussed is just emphasizing flexibility and financial responsibility of our groups. So we do this process called rollbacks, where any unused funds leave the group's account and come back to our general account, but we are postponing that until June of 2021 to just allow groups to have more flexibility with their spending of our funding this year. And if there are any questions that you still have after this presentation that are not answered today, please feel free to reach out to us. And we love talking to student groups and helping with funding however we can.
Thanks so much for the information, Andy. I'd like to ask you a couple questions. First, about how many folks are involved in the ASG Finance Committee that review all the applications and deliberate on these?
Definitely. So we actually just finished our recruitment process, and we have a ton of awesome new members. So as I said, our committee is broken into 5 tiers. So how it works is at the top the committee is me and my co-chair, Paula. And then for each tier specifically, we have something called an account director. So these are essentially the tier leaders. They oversee all of the groups within each tier. So there's 5 of those. And then each tier has about 5 to 6 what we call account executives. So these are the members who are assigned to specific groups within each tier, and they're the ones signing off on all of the vouchers. So it's about 5 to 6 account executives per tier, and we have 5 tiers. So it's about 30 to 35 members that we have on our committee.
Perfect. And then I know you've been involved with this committee for a while. This isn't your first funding cycle reviewing these applications. Can you share maybe just 1 or 2 categories of expenses or different items that student groups request that they might not realize ASG won't provide any funding for? Is there anything that comes to mind as like a common category of item?
Yeah, so I think some of the biggest things we see is that food and merchandise are some of the most popular requests, and it's unfortunate that our funding does not allow for us to fund these things, but those are definitely really popular. I guess there are some exceptions for food that if we deem food crucial to the success of the event, so if it's a Ramadan or some other like holiday that is where food is obviously a necessity, then we can make exceptions, but overall food is not something that we can really fund.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Andy. I know you have another occasion coming up in a little bit, but stick around for as long as you need to. And thanks so much. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon.
Definitely. Thank you.
Before transitioning it over to Chelsea, I'd actually like to share my screen one more time because as Andy mentioned, the ASG allocations make up a lot of budget that student organizations rely on to put on events. But there's also a lot of other places where student organizations can seek grants to cover any sort of funding gap they have, or if they are a brand new organization, or if they have an idea for something that might not get funded by those ASG categories. On the Student Orgs and Activities page, if you navigate to the Organization Officers tab, and then select the funding page from the drop-down menu, we update this page regularly. And some of these grants and other funding opportunities are through the SOA office. For example, the Student Activities Assistance Fund is one that we manage in conjunction with Student Enrichment Services. That's more for individual funding needs. So students who participate in one of the competitive sports clubs that might need to buy their own equipment or uniform, they can apply for the SAAF if they have financial need and get those expenses reimbursed if they're eligible. But there's also a number of different grants. And for those groups that are looking for opportunities to fundraise for a specific event or activity, we encourage you to check out this page. And if you're an office that has a grant that student organizations can apply to, let our office know. And we will update the website with information as we go. One of the opportunities you would find on here is Catalyzer, and we are joined by Chelsea Mattson, who's going to tell us a little bit about that. And for those of you who follow SOA on Instagram, you may have noticed this week's trivia question had a Catalyzer theme to it, which was, which organization has raised the most money through a Catalyzer campaign? And perhaps Chelsea can enlighten us with a little more information about that and tell us about the Catalyzer program in general. Thanks for joining, Chelsea. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Yep. So glad to be here. The group actually that raised the most amount of money on Catalyzer historically was NU Crew, and they raised $22,000 through their month-long Catalyzer, which is super exciting. I'm going to share my screen now. Great. So you may have heard of Catalyzer, you may not have, but it is Northwestern's crowdfunding platform, mainly for student groups on campus. So some of the great stuff about Catalyzer is there are no fees. So I know a lot of student groups will come to me saying they want to do a GoFundMe instead, and things like that take out fees from your overall funds that you're getting from donors. These funds will go directly into your SOFO account that Joe talked about earlier. We have 4 fundraising cycles, which are fall, Cats Give Back, winter, and spring. And they're all throughout the year. They go with the academic site quarters. And you can fundraise anywhere between $500 and $15,000. As I said, a new crew went above that. So you can go as high as donors are willing to give. So if your goal is $15,000, but donors just want to keep giving money to you, like you can raise however much they're willing to give, which is really exciting. The 3 musts for a Catalyzer project is you must have a SOFO account and be in good standing with the Office of Student Affairs, which Joe is my go-to person when it comes to knowing if your group is in good standing. You must be registered with SOA for at least a year, and you must have a specific project to fundraise for. So you can see this is an example of the Catalyzer page. So there's like various projects that can be fundraised for on here. We have groups all the way up from Dolphin Show to like Formula Racing, SASA, NUFA, which is the Women's Film Association. So it can be any group as long as you went along with the 3 musts in the last slide. I work with all of the groups throughout the entire cycle, so don't be worried if you've never fundraised before. It is a bit of an undertaking because you'll work with me to create a marketing plan, an email outreach plan, descriptions and photos like you see on this page. We work on that together throughout a month-long prep period before you actually start fundraising. So once you start fundraising, you will be fully prepared to raise money. I'm also there throughout the entire fundraising process to brainstorm with, come up with ideas, troubleshoot, congratulate you on reaching your goal. So never be worried if you've never done this before. We have a lot of new groups every year that do super well in fundraising and raising money for their projects. So some of the things that Catalyzer cannot be used for are listed here. This is because your funds are coming directly from donors, and the way that donor money can be used is pretty specific based on IRS guidelines. So these are the things that they absolutely can't be used for. And it can be frustrating, but I'm also here to work with you to find things that you can fundraise for your project. A lot of groups will try to fundraise for like a banquet and they want to get beverages or something, and you can't fundraise for that, but you can fundraise for the event rental fee. You can fundraise for speaker panels when we can travel. You can pay for a speaker to come to campus because it's an educational outlet that is like coming to the Northwestern community. So there's a lot of ways to raise money. I know this list seems a little daunting, but if you have questions or want to see what kinds of projects you can fundraise for, feel free to reach out to me because we can definitely find something that works for you. So these are some of the key considerations for approving projects. The funds must further Northwestern's educational mission. So that's kind of ambiguous, but it can be anywhere from a theater group putting on a production that the Northwestern community is allowed to go see. It could be a speaker panel that you invite Northwestern students to for free. So there's a very wide range of things that you can fundraise for. And like I said, the 501c3 status, that's just the IRS guidelines that for the last slide, the things you can't fundraise for, but I wouldn't be too worried about that. So that is me. Sorry, I flew through that really quickly. Joe, I think you have questions for me?
Absolutely, Chelsea. I'm wondering if you could walk us through what the application period is and really give us a sense of like how much work it is that a group needs to invest to participate in Catalyzer.
Sure. So if you go onto the Catalyzer website, you'll see that we have all of the application cycles written out from the time you can apply to closing, and then what the actual fundraising period is and when the funds would be put into your account. So usually it's like about a month and a week that we have the application open process for each cycle. So it's usually plenty of time. It's just kind of a preliminary application that just asks you about your group and what kind of project you want to fundraise for. It's by no means final. We can always work on things, but you can go to the Catalyzer page and you can also read all of the information that I had in my presentation on there. And then what was the second question you had, Joe?
I'm wondering what you hear from students about how much time it takes to invest in the Catalyzer campaign.
Yeah, so I have heard from student groups that it is a little bit of a time investment, but it also, I think, is worth it because this is the platform that you can raise the most money for a project across campus for a student group. I think it's more time intensive because you are creating like a marketing plan and you do have to email your friends and family and alumni of your group, and that takes time. But I do think it's worth it. I would say probably the biggest amount of time you spend is probably in the prep period, because after that, you're just implementing the plan that you spent a month working on. I will say though that we do require 2 project leaders per student group. So that way not all of the work is on one student leader, because that would be a lot. So it's all about delegating, and you can also include your group members to help you.
Terrific. Ayala or Imani, if either of you have any questions, feel free to jump in. We're a small enough crowd today that you can just unmute yourself and ask anything you wish. And if you don't have questions, that's fine too.
Can Catalyzer funds be used for publishing, printing?
That's a good question. I think it depends on what the publishing will be used for. So for Catalyzer, it goes, I didn't really touch on this, but it goes through an application and approval process through my office, which also includes Joe to review, and also our accounting and gift and record services office. So the accounting and the GRS office have a better handling on the actual IRS rules on like how the funds can be used. But if that is something your group wants to reach out to me about, I can definitely give you a more concrete answer that they would be able to provide me with.
Yeah, I will just add, oftentimes it comes down to the educational value of what the expense is. So if it is an organization that, you know, publishing something or printing something is going to be part of marketing and advertising, that's one category. If it's strictly a publication-based organization like North by Northwestern or Helicon or Spoon or something like that, that's going to be classified differently. So yeah, it's really kind of a case-by-case basis on a lot of different expenses, depending on what the purpose is behind it, as well as whether it serves more of like a private individual or the community at large in terms of that educational purpose.
Yeah. But yeah, definitely email me.
I will also add that one of the great things that Chelsea highlighted about Catalyzer is groups are able to raise a lot of money. I mean, it's something that a student could take on their own privately and just say, hey, I'm going to try and raise as much money for this as possible. But Chelsea's office just has a vast amount of resources to get you in touch with contacts and to strategize. And they've seen a lot of organizations that aren't even necessarily the ones with really high membership numbers and haven't been around for like a historically long time, still make a big splash with a fundraising campaign just because they're able to get the Catalyzer announcements out there to a really broad pool of people that are interested in giving to Northwestern. And folks really like giving to specific projects. They know the money's going to get used. They know it's going to go to students. It's going to benefit the Northwestern community at large. And so, you know, it's a program that I know we're really proud to partner with alumni relations and the development team.
Yeah, and to touch on that, Joe, I will say for all of the cycles, the fundraising cycles, we send out 1 to 2 emails out to all alumni, so it gets a really far reach. We also post on our official Facebook groups, so it's not just you all trying to fundraise. We also have our resources that we do our best to get your project out there.
I'm going to jump back to just a couple announcements to wrap. If anyone has any questions, feel free to add it to the chat and we will address those after we stop the recording. So again, you're seeing an image from the SOA website with our menu of funding and fundraising opportunities for registered student orgs. Groups find out about these certainly by word of mouth, but we also have a weekly newsletter that goes out to all the student organization officers. So as new opportunities open up, as deadlines approach, new opportunities just, you know, get developed in terms of grant programs, that is a common way we let folks know about it. And then just to wrap, quick reminder, this time next week, we'll be talking with folks from a few different student organizations that have really made an impact with their social media, especially in this virtual environment. So for organizations that are looking for tips to build that audience and ideas for content and build engagement and community using social media, you're going to want to tune into that. We'll be uploading this recording to the SOA YouTube channel. Information about that will be included on Wildcat Connection as well as our Friday newsletter. And make sure you follow us on Instagram and Facebook for updates for other SOA chats and SOA programming. The last thing I'll share is we are busy planning a signature event that is free for all students on Friday the 13th. So again, more to come. Keep an eye on SOA social media for that. We'll have a mix of events provided by student organizations, some curated by SOA, as well as some from some professional entertainment and activities providers. So with that, I'm going to thank everyone who tuned in. If you have any questions, reach out to me at studentorgs@northwestern.edu. And thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.